a conversation with best-selling authors that's part of our nationwide celebration of Teacher Appreciation Week. Here in Texas, more than 100 companies and organizations have joined together through the Texas Teachers Can Coalition to honor teachers and to elevate the profession. You can visit teacherscan.org to learn more and to thank a teacher who deserves to be celebrated. Our distinguished guests today are Jenna Bush Hager, the co-host of NBC's Today with Hoda and Jenna, and the author of Anna's Story, A Journey of Hope, and the co-author with her sister Barbara Pierce Bush of Sisters First, both New York Times #1 bestsellers, as well as 2 children's books with her mother, former First Lady Laura Bush. Stephen Harrigan, a journalist, screenwriter, and author of 11 books, is best known for the best-selling novel The Gates of the Alamo, as well as the novels Remembering Ben Clayton and Challenger Park. He most recently published Big Wonderful Thing, The Sweeping History of Texas. And Lawrence Wright, staff writer for The New Yorker, screenwriter and playwright, author of 12 books, including The Looming Tower, Al-Qaeda and the Road to 9/11, which was awarded the Pulitzer Prize, and most recently, the novel The End of October, which eerily predicts a global pandemic. Thanks to the 3 of you for your time this morning. I want to go back to the very beginning of all of your lives to start here and ask each of you to talk a bit about where you're from and talk in particular about your school experience, going back all those years, what it was like to be in school, thinking ahead to what your life would turn out to be. Did you know you wanted to be a writer at an early age? And who were the teachers who influenced you? Jenna, you are the only native Texan on this call.
Well, I am?
You are.
I feel like I'm the least distinguished Texan on this call, but distinguished Texan, but I can't believe that. Yeah, I was born in Midland in West Texas, and I moved all around Texas. I lived in Dallas, and I know these 2 gentlemen from Austin, where their daughters went to Austin High School with me. We all graduated the class of 2000. And so I went to a lot of different types of schools. I went to public school in Dallas. I went to public school for 1 year in Washington, D.C. I went to Hockaday, which is an all-girls school in Dallas, for 1 year. I went to St. Andrews in Austin, and then I finished at Austin High. So we moved around quite a bit because of my parents' work and
family business.
The family business, which Barbara and I have decided to retire from. But we, you know, it's so funny. I was a teacher. I taught 6th grade and in inner city DC and in Baltimore. And it really was the teachers who comfort you, who bring you in when you're the new kid. And when your dad has just been elected governor and you're walking in mid-year of the 7th grade, which we all remember the 7th grade, whether we want to or not.
Right, it's the worst.
It's the worst, and it's a hard year to change schools. And it's the teachers that make you feel loved. And Mrs. Nazaro, who was the head of St. Andrews, is she still the head of St. Andrews now? No.
She's not, but she's definitely still a beloved figure, Lucy Nazaro, in this community. We do love her.
I remember walking, you know, I was probably taller than she was even in the 7th grade, and coming, and she shook my hand and escorted me to the class and made me feel welcome. And I think when we think about the teachers who inspire and who lift up, they do so much more than just teach. Right. You know, they meet the kids where they are.
She's the one who comes to mind for you right off the bat.
She's the one. And there was also another teacher in Dallas named Miss Cunningham. And people that know my sister know she's effortlessly brilliant. She's the type that won the math award in 3rd grade and, you know, with her eyes closed. And so as a twin, I sometimes felt like the lesser, although my parents tried really hard not to compare us. And I had one teacher named Mrs. Cunningham, Patricia Cunningham at Hockaday School, who said, "You can write. You have a great imagination. You should write." And nobody had ever really said that to me before. Yeah. And actually, we looked her up. The show looked her up because they were going to surprise me with her today. And she's passed away 4 years after she retired from the Hockaday School.
Well, how great that you've called her out as an inspiration. Now, Steve and Larry, amazingly, given the fact that I think of the 2 of you almost as one person, Steve and Larry, right, as long as I've known you, you are both weirdly from Oklahoma City. Is that right? You were both born
In the same hospital.
In the same hospital.
Yeah.
How creepy is that?
We didn't think it was
Why
creepy.
would you think it's creepy? I think
It's pretty, personally, I think that's kind of creepy. All right, so Steve, you got to Austin kind of in a circuitous way, right? You went through Abilene, Corpus Christi before coming to Austin. But talk a little bit about your own version of what Jenna just told us, kind of going through school and thinking about how you wanted to live your life and become a writer, if that's something that occurred to you, and who influenced you.
Well, I was taught almost exclusively in grade school by nuns. I went to Catholic school all the way through until the end, I'm afraid. Yep. And, Sister Robert, Sister Martha, Sister Aloysius, they all had an impact on me, but in a kind of aggregate way, because we never got a good look at them. They had these habits on, and all we saw were their faces. So I know I'm not saying they blend together, but it was interesting visually because they did kind of. But I remember, I guess my most important impression of being taught by nuns was that it was a kind of unabashed moral education. It was less about the grades you got than the kind of person they perceived you as becoming.
Well, that was the point, right? I mean,
I think so. Yeah. I mean,
what is that sort of educational experience about, but the moral life, right?
It was very, very front and center, and whether that was, whether it was overt or whether it was something I just sort of, took in by osmosis. I think, all these teachers had a big effect on me.
Did anybody talk to you at that time about writing or about wanting to become a writer one day? I mean, obviously, Jen has told us about a teacher who saw something in her that was important to her, and she still thinks back on that as a formative moment for her. Did any of the nuns or anybody else in that school or any of those schools try to make you into the person you are now?
Not specifically that I can remember, but I remember this very vivid moment in 6th grade where I was goofing off and drawing a bunch of silly pictures, and Sister Aloysius came and grabbed them off my desk and said, "You stop that. You've got a good head on your shoulders." And that was the first time I ever heard anything like that from any teacher. And I was sort of shocked into compliance. I thought maybe there is something about me that is worth pursuing after all.
Yeah, all the years I've known you, Steve, that may be the last time you were a scofflaw. The last time you were a troublemaker.
That was it.
One time, and then you're out. That's it.
Yeah, I took the straight and narrow path from then on.
Larry, am I remembering that you're a graduate of Woodrow Wilson High School in Dallas? Is that right?
Yes, indeed.
Tell the story of your time there, and again, how'd you become this person, and who was important in you becoming that person?
Well, I grew up in Oklahoma City and Abilene, where Steve and I lived at the same time.
Again, creepy. I'm sorry.
We met in Abilene a couple of years ago, and went to past my old school, and he was always curious about where his Catholic school had been because it had been torn down. And there happened to be an exhibit at the museum in downtown Abilene of Abilene in the 40s and 50s when we lived there. And it was like going back into our lives. There were models with the tropical shirts that our dads wore and stuff like that, and the kitchenware and so on. And there was a map of Abilene in 1955. And I looked on the map, and there was St. Joseph's. Is that right, Steve?
Yeah, St. Joseph's.
It was right across the street from my elementary school. And I thought we could have been friends a long time ago if we'd just been able to walk across the street. And Protestants and Catholics.
You saw the spot where Larry was struck by lightning.
Yeah, right outside the Alta Vista Elementary School.
This is a true story.
Yeah, it was, I think, ball lightning. It hit the schoolhouse and it went down the gutter. And we were a bunch of kids, standing beside the gutter, the downspout, and all of a sudden we're all lying on the ground. There was no actual injury. It was just, the explosion of the lightning, I think, that knocked us to the ground. But then we moved to Dallas, and I went to J.L. Long Middle School, and then to Woodrow Wilson. uh, honestly, during that period of time, I felt pretty isolated. Like Jenna, I'd moved in, a number of different schools, and coming in at, when people had spent their entire childhood going to school with each other, and then you come in as a new kid. I never really got to be anything other than the new kid. But there was a teacher in my senior year in high school, Miss Inlow, Elizabeth Inlow. She taught English, and on Fridays we had to come in with a short story.
Yeah.
We were given an assignment. We had to use 3 words that the class voted on and fit them into a story. And the challenge was just a lot of fun for me. And there was only one other person in the class that took it as seriously as I did, Johnny Pinder, who became a pharmacist. But I was always trying to outdo Johnny Pinder. And so I had a little competition, and that made it worth striving even harder. But I thought this is something I might be able to do. And I really appreciate Miss Inlow. And years later, when my first book came out, I sent her a copy and thanked her for it.
Yeah, well, we all had ideas as kids about what we wanted to do, and maybe they turned out the way we thought. Maybe it all turned out the way we thought, maybe not. But here we are all these years later. You've each written both fiction and nonfiction. Jenna, your writing has tended to be the most personal, at least in my view of it, of the three of you, because you have literally written, you've written a book with your sister. You've written a book that is about to come out in September. It was to have been out, I think, already, but it's now out in September, about what you learned from your amazing grandparents. The question I want to ask all of you, but Jenna first, is where do the ideas that become your books come from? Like, what is the genesis of these ideas? I mean, obviously you have grandparents like your grandparents. That's probably not a long walk to decide to tell the world about them. But how do the ideas come to you?
I'm sort of embarrassed to even be sitting on this panel, because one of you has a Pulitzer, and Stephen Harrigan we've been a fan of his literature forever. So I think of myself as more of a storyteller, and whether that's for the Today Show or it's personal stories. But for the last book that I wrote it in the year after I lost my 3 remaining grandparents. Right. I lost 2 of them publicly, which was, we weren't prepared for it. I wasn't prepared for it, because losing somebody publicly means the night that I lost my grandmother, for example, I was all alone in my apartment in New York, and I turned on the TV to a special report, and some things said about her that felt real and true, and some that felt wrong, to me, at least as her granddaughter. So for the last book, it was journal writing as a way of therapy. And I was pregnant at this time too, and I got a new job. And so I come from a long line of people that would wake up and write. Whether my grandfather, a lot of his writing was through letters, but my grandmother was a journal writer. And I remember sneaking into her room in Maine to use her computer when I was a teacher to print something, when I was working on my lesson plans for the following year. And I saw her later in life, when she couldn't write as well, her journal in her computer, and it said, "The twins are here." And I kind of looked away shocked, because I didn't want to know what she thought about it.
Oh no, you totally wanted to, and you totally read it, didn't you?
I didn't. I couldn't. She was the one person that scared me enough to turn. Even though I love to pry, and everybody loves to read other people's journals, let's be totally honest. But the last book was really just an act of love to them and to myself, to get over this loss, because anybody that's lost somebody they love knows it can hurt, and it can sting, and it can feel like so real. And then it became more of an exploration. As I read articles about my grandmother, one of which was about her changing views of the transgender community. I'm not sure if you read it. I met with the author that wrote that article for The Atlantic, because I just wanted to learn more about them. I missed them. And so that's how the last book came to be. It was like, and I didn't even really know it was going to be a book until it was.
Well, just as they were public people. Your relationship with them being private now becomes public and is right through this book. Larry, we've just not long ago had a long talk about your current book. Obviously 9/11 happens and you think, I'm running to the story, right? The looming tower happens because that story has got all of us in its grip. But this new novel, The End of October, I know that from talking to you that the original idea that became this book is at least a decade old. Jenna and I were saying before we started today how amazing it is that you were able to see into the future. As much as you demur and say, I'm not psychic, I'm not God, I'm not Nostradamus, what you did was produce a novel well in advance of the events that we're all experiencing now that were pretty dead on. But this is really a 10-year-old idea, is it not?
Yeah, it started with Ridley Scott, the filmmaker, and he had read the Cormac McCarthy novel, The Road. And it's a post-apocalyptic novel, a father and his son wandering through the ruins of civilization. And Ridley's question was, what happened? What would, bring civilization to such a low point? And so I thought about nuclear war but I'd done some stories when I was a young reporter about pandemics and disease outbreaks. And I had worked with a lot of people at the Centers for Disease Control. And I just got really fascinated with the world. The people that are fighting diseases, they're essentially puzzle solvers. Every disease is a riddle. And, it takes a certain kind of mentality to be able to devote your life to solving those kinds of riddles. It's not just an intellectual puzzle, though, because it's dangerous.
Yeah.
And that combination of courage and a particular kind of ingenuity, I found really intriguing, and I was enchanted and in some awe with these people. And so I decided I would write originally a screenplay that Ridley never made, but it wasn't his fault. I hadn't solved the problem really of the story, and when I decided to go back to it as a novel, I thought I'll have to do the research I didn't do, because that's the way that I find my stories. I have to know how it would really happen. And if I know the nuts and bolts of how things actually work, I'll be able to explain it to the reader, and I'll be able to understand it myself.
Well, I was the other day when we talked about this, and I tried to get you to say, yes, I'm psychic. And you said, I'm not psychic. I'm a reporter.
Yeah.
And what I do is I ask questions and I get information. And my job, as you just said, is to take that information, internalize it, understand something well enough that I can then tell people about it. That's really what you do.
Well,
right?
All the stuff that people are saying is prescient or prophecy. Mainly that comes from talking to experts who have devoted their careers to answering the question that I posed to them, which was, what would happen if something like the 1918 flu happened in our society, modern day? Would we be any better prepared than our ancestors? And they spent their whole lives, their whole careers thinking about that. And I talked to them. I read the papers, I read the books, I read the briefing books, the tabletop exercises every year. At Johns Hopkins and elsewhere, they would have tabletop exercises that posed exactly those questions. So the information was always out there.
Yeah. It's fascinating. Steve, it seems to me that Larry's books, not exclusively, but largely, are kind of contemporary. Mm-hmm. They sort of look ahead, or they're at least set in the now. Your books tend to look back. Obviously, you've written a history of Texas that is every bit as good as any history that has been written ever. But so many of your other books are really thinking back and helping us understand with context and insight and perspective, in fictional versions of these stories, kind of what happened behind us. You're fascinated by the stories of what's already happened.
Yeah, and I think, you said earlier, Evan, that you're asking how ideas come to us.
Yeah.
I think it's more like we're infiltrated by ideas, and they slowly sort of develop and percolate. And in my case, almost every novel I've written goes back like one novel I wrote, I remember thinking about it when Jenna and our kids were in high school together, and I wrote 25 years later or something like that, I actually wrote it.
Pops back up as an actual thing.
Yeah, right. And it's, I mean, the book I'm working on now, it's a novel. It's something I've been thinking about since I was 5 years old in one way or another. It's about a strange book about a novel about an escaped leopard from Oklahoma City Zoo in 1950. And
right.
Why in the world this would be a subject for anybody's novel is unfathomable. But to me, I remember seeing this stuffed leopard in the Oklahoma City Zoo when I was very, very young. And it had some sort of profound effect on me. And, I then did what Larry did.
Steve, profound positive or profound negative?
Profound mysterious.
Profound
why? What is this leopard in the middle of a place of living animals? Why is there a stuffed animal?
Yeah.
And why is it so still? And what's the story behind it? And so a few years ago, I just got curious about my childhood fascination with that creature, and I began researching it. And it turned out that Oklahoma City went insane in 1950 because of this escaped leopard, and everybody was out on the streets with guns and hunting dogs, and helicopters were flying over. Everybody was trying to kill this leopard, and it's just struck me as a really sort of fascinating and profound moment coming right after World War II, the city just going unhinged like that.
So in a case like this, Larry, and I want to ask each of you about this, when you've sort of settled on an idea, what is your process for writing this book? In the case of, say, the escaped leopard novel, are you doing the kind of research that you would do if you were reporting a nonfiction book? Are you actually going back and trying to piece together a narrative that would roughly align with what really happened? Or how much of that is a process in your head, and how much of that is processed out in the world?
Well, I have to go through the same process as writing a New Yorker story or a nonfiction book. It's just, to me, it's all, it's very similar experience, because you just as a reporter, you normally ask the question, what happened? But in a novel, your question is, what would happen?
Right.
In this kind of novel, and it's not that much of a change.
Yeah.
And creates imagination. The more you research something, the more you look into it, the more knowledge you gain about it, the more your imagination is fired by the possibilities of what you write.
And Jenna, even in the case of, say, the books you wrote for kids with your mom, right, or the children's version of Sisters First, right? You did an adult version and a kids version. There is still work that goes into preparing to write that book. It's not just you sit down one day and you write it out. There is a process that is different from what Larry and Steve are describing, but it's still a process, right?
Yes, I mean, definitely. And it's also quite hilarious to write something with your mother. For example, our book, Our Great Big Backyard, I called her and I said, the Today Show just called. They want me to do a series. It's the centennial of the national parks. This is the children's book we should be writing. And she said, I was on maternity leave with my second daughter, Poppy. And she said, okay, get to writing, get going. And then I wrote it. And she is, and as Steve's worked with her a little bit, Steve wrote some hilarious speeches for her that I still steal some of his lines about her being a librarian that really knocked the socks off of them, Steve. All these years later, they still work. But he knows that she is a really great, tenacious editor. And I think editing is something that is so important. And my dad, on this last book that I wrote, I was also on maternity leave. I seem to just only be procreating these years. But and by the way, Lawrence, congratulations. Kara, I saw on Instagram yesterday.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
You're going to be a granddad, Caroline.
Again, yes, it was her first. So we can't. We're so thrilled.
It is so fun. But my dad sat with me while I was on maternity leave with this newest book. And he didn't think that it was edited to the way that it should be edited. And we talked through every single word. And I do think that, I took a class at the University of Texas. And of course, now I'm not going to remember the name or the professor, but maybe I can tell you later. But everybody said, take this class because it's the hardest, and he's the best at getting, your sentences to perfection, to getting you straight to the point. And I think editing is a really important part of the process, and one which luckily my family is very helpful with. And although I might have written the children's books, my mom is the one that made them what they are, because she got them to be, the sentences to be sharp. And luckily I have parents that are willing to help out.
Knowing your parents as I have over the years, I'd have to say your mother would be an absolutely formidable editor. Your dad might be fun to talk about this stuff with. Right?
It was fun, but he does not believe in long sentences. He was like, and this book, because I was on maternity leave, I sent in the draft, and I was used to for Sisters First, we had a really, really thorough, wonderful editor who pushed and pushed. And you guys know it makes a big difference. Yeah. And this last editor, I was like, loved it, but you want somebody to kind of question it too. And he's good at talking through and questioning and saying, do we need this? This is redundant or whatever. And there were no arguments. I was just so grateful that he would take the time to go through a full book with me, word through, every single word we looked at, and it was fun too.
That's the transparent, the part of the process that is not as transparent to the end user, Steve and Larry, is the editing process. People think you come up with an idea, you write the book, and then boop, there it is. When the fact is, there's a lot that goes on between the time you turn in a manuscript and you'll see it. And in the case, Larry, of your magazine work over the years, you've had the good fortune to be at the New Yorker, at least, working with some of the very best editors in the business, right? And presumably these people are as much of a help to you as I imagine they are to other writers there.
Oh, editors, as you say, they don't get very much credit. Their name is not on the book or the article. But when you finish an article, for instance, and you think, I'm done. This is perfect. This is exactly what I had in mind. And what you want is praise. But what you need is a sledgehammer. And because, when you've written something, it's frozen. Right. And but suddenly, an editor comes in with a sledgehammer and makes everything fragmented again, and suddenly you can put the pieces back together in a better way, a more logical or intriguing order. And then there are a lot of the skills that you learn, especially in the magazine trade, where you have to cut. Oftentimes when they say I've got a 12,000 word piece, I need to take out 1,500 words. I'll say, well, cut the cartoon. Right. There's an easy solution here, right. But you have to learn to accommodate yourself to the realities of the job.
Steve, I'm going to observe that something that you may know that Larry surely knows, and that is that one of the very first pieces I ever edited at Texas Monthly many, many years ago, about 30 years ago, was a piece by Lawrence Wright about castrating sex offenders.
One of his
and to Larry's point,
still a good idea.
But to Larry's point, the piece came in and it was too long, and I went in dutifully, kind of young editor trying to impress the guy I was working with, and went in and cut the piece down by about 11 inches of this long story. And then when Larry returned it back to me after I turned the edit over to him, he had reinstated the 11 inches. And so I guess he wanted me to cut the cartoon, Steve. Steve, you've worked with the same publisher for a while, have you not?
Yeah, well, I tend to have used Knopf has published probably my last 4 or 5 books, but the book I just published was commissioned by
the University of Texas Press, right? Yeah. Yes, but the Knopf books that you published, did you work with a consistent editor? Is it a style that you develop over time, a rhythm?
Yes. Larry and I both have the same editor, a wonderful editor named Ann Close, who has been there for many, many years. And Ann is a brilliant editor, and one of the
unsung hero, right?
Unsung hero, and although we sing her praises all the time, but part of her brilliance is the way she edits by misdirection or indirection, I guess. Sometimes I remember I turned in a manuscript and she said, well, there's something wrong with the last third of it.
That was her big idea.
It was brilliant. It was so, she could have gone line by line, paragraph by, but what a great book editor does, as well as sort of copy edit and line, is give you a sense of a kind of global problem.
Right.
It's your book, and you're the one ultimately who's responsible for finding that solution. And I just think it's it's so thrilling to be edited by Anne, because she can just point you in these directions that you then have to kind of solve. And there's a mystery to it that I really enjoy.
That's exactly right. The best editors make something you write more of yours, not more of theirs.
Exactly. Yeah. But I wanted to mention what a great editor you are, Evan, and what a fantastic job you did at Texas Monthly. During at the Texas Tribune. I mean, you're a national treasure as well.
Well, you're very nice to say that. The best cover we ever did in all those years at Texas Monthly was Jenna Bush.
I thought you were going to say, I kind of remember one, and I think you wrote it, but maybe I'm wrong. Son of a Bushy, was that you?
I might have written the line. Then I probably ran as far away from your dad as possible. But I love the story that we wrote about you at that time. Well, Steve, you're very nice to say that. I want to ask you guys a little bit about what you wish you knew all those years later. Jenna, you're on book 5, right? This book about your grandparents will be the 5th book that you will have written or co-written.
I think so. I haven't counted, but I think that's right.
So if maybe 6. Go back to young you. What one bit of advice as a writer that you do you now, after all these years, wish you had back then?
Well, I'm pretty lucky because I have a mom that gave me some good advice. And I remember I loved to play Barbies. I have a feeling Dorothy Harrigan probably loved to make up stories and play Barbies too. And to a point where my mom was actually felt like she needed to talk to a doctor, because I would wake up early. It was constant. It was, would interrupt other things. And now I have a daughter who I go into Zoom school, and she's down on the floor creating these, soap operas with her dolls. Right. And my mom was worried. And then she read a profile on Toni Morrison that said she loved playing dolls to create these worlds. Yeah. And, then it just pacified my mom, and she thought, oh, Jenna will write. And she said that to me. She gave me that, she empowered me in a way, because no kid, our kids, I didn't think, oh, I can go do this. You have to empower your children to believe that they can be what you see in them. And my mom did that for me. And so, I also think learning about what you want to write is so important. For me, it was writing what I know. And I think being authentic for life is so important. And it's not something that everybody feels comfortable doing or is born with. And I think that we really have to empower our children to know that, that the words that they're saying have truth, that they mean something. And as a mom, I think if anything, she prepared me for motherhood, which to me is the most important job.
Yeah. So encouraging young people who are thinking maybe one day they want to do this, just go with what you know, right?
Yeah. Go with what you know, and be yourself, which is I know that it's a cliche, but it's a cliche because it's not that easy for everybody.
Yeah, I think it's
great.
It's great.
I watch kids not be feeling comfortable in their own skin. And I think we've all felt that before.
Steve, what's the one thing you wish you had known all the way back?
If I could go back to being a kid, the advice I would give myself is pay attention, ask questions, make notes. If I would give anything to have a diary from when I was a kid, about the things I did and the things I saw. And I wish I could go back and read all the newspapers I ignored when I was a kid. But the interesting thing that Jenna said really struck me. She was playing with dolls. I was playing with toy soldiers and plastic cowboys and stuff like that. And I realize now I was a novelist in training. When I was down on the floor with all these little plastic figures, because they each had this certain sort of character valence to me.
Mhm.
Everybody had a backstory, right?
Yeah, they were somebody, and the way they were configured, the way their faces were modeled, gave them a personality, which gave me a story that I could then imagine and later maybe even tell. So I didn't know what I was doing when I was playing, but I think Jenna's point is really important. That play is a critical factor in the development of careers, I guess, or certainly of imagination.
Larry, you seem to have everything together always. I never see you in a bead of sweat on your forehead, right? I know that's the part we don't see, the submerged part of the iceberg, right? We just see the visible part. But is there anything that you wish you had known back then that would have made you better at this than you are now?
Well, I was thinking about that as Jenna and Steve were talking, and it took me a long time to establish my career. I was in a trade, the magazine journalism trade, and it was hard to, I didn't have enough money or confidence to try to spread my wings anyway, because I didn't have, I couldn't afford to. I had to just keep in line. And then there came a time when I finally got into the staff of the New Yorker, and I was beginning to write some books. And I made this resolution that I would only do things that were important or fun. And it's helped me so much because life gives you many choices. And, and the one that, I've been following was, my career, money, but it didn't allow for either of those things necessarily. And so once I made that resolution, I found that my life changed enormously. And, I love to be a part of the national conversation, but I don't want to miss out on the joy that this profession in particular can bring. So, as I've gotten older and I, think, I only have so many projects remaining, I find that I'm just experimenting with all these things that I wish that I'd done years ago. I love writing plays and movies, and I've been working on a musical about Texas politics. I wish I'd written musical comedy years ago. It's just far more fun. And so, when important things arise, I'll jump on them if it's placed for me. But, I think within those parameters that you can make a very happy life for yourself. And had I been able to talk to the younger self, I would have said, shoot for that.
Yeah. Have fun is, as advice goes, pretty good, honestly. If we all just understand that there's a lot of value in that, I think that's great. So here we are all sitting in our houses. We're all these days little boxes on screens, right? There is no today, there is no tomorrow, there is no weekend, there is no weekday, there's just now, right? All of this weirdness has kind of collapsed time. But it has had an impact on all of us. And I want to ask each of you, sitting in the little box on my screen in your house, how this pandemic has affected the creative process over the last 8 weeks. Because as we sit here today, here we are on May the 5th, we've been at this for roughly 2 months. We don't know, we were talking about this before we started, we don't know how long this is going to be, how long we're going to be these little boxes, and how long we're going to be working from home. Jenna, you obviously have a job that you've managed to do pretty well from home. You've got young kids running around and there are distractions and all that, but you've been able to do your program right from home.
Yes, which had somebody told us, we had just got in a studio audience, which was a big deal. And there were people and, I was thinking on May the 1st, Mrs. Obama was supposed to be there and we were going to have all first generation college students. Like we had just, got in our program to where I'd always dreamed. But at the same time, as far as creativity goes. So that's one thing is that you can't plan, for the future and don't put all of your hopes into a career because things could change at any moment. You really have to focus on a life. And I think what you said about happiness and figuring out what really, lights your fire, what makes you happy is the most important thing. But, I lived in New York City. I had 2 kids. We were on the subway, we were running. And this time with my kids has been, hard, many moments that are difficult, but also I had never stared at my little baby Hal's arms. I mean, I realized the other day Henry was playing with the girls and he was on a blanket, and I was staring at his little sausage arms. And I thought, these are the moments that I was working a lot, and I think that's where creativity stems from, right? Those are the details that Steve wishes he wrote down, the way his little baby's arms look. And I just stared at his arms and thought, these are the moments that I want to write down, that I want to remember. And, there is a lot of despair and sadness right now, and especially in New York where I live, and a lot of uncertainty. But if we can find some sort of hope among that, it's in the little sausage arms of my 8-month-old baby. And I think those are the things I'm trying to appreciate.
Larry, what are your sausage arms? What are your unexpected joys, your silver lining in all this? And how has this, generally speaking, affected you and yours and the way that you think about your work?
Well, it's hard, I like a lot of, especially the creative friends of mine, it's demoralizing to be sidelined, to not be able to get out and do the kind of work that I'm supposed to be doing. I feel handicapped, by being at home and trying to do my reporting or whatever on the phone or on Zoom. And so those things are obstacles. And, I miss, playing music with my friends. I'm in a band and I really miss that. And so, and the club is closed down, so I hope it comes back to life. But, I miss all those things. I'm worried about not being able to see our grandchildren in Evanston, and I don't know when that will happen. So all of those things are on my mind. On the other hand, I'm so grateful that I have something I can do. I can continue to write. I'm tired of people telling me that Shakespeare wrote King Lear while he was in quarantine. Just enough of this, just trying to get through another article. But I'm fortunate in so many ways, and also it's a weird, I have this book out that is that has thrust me in the conversation.
Yep.
And I have something to say. I feel like we're at a crossroads as a society, and this is we know now so clearly the shortcomings of our partisanship, of our, the lack of preparation, the incompetence of so much of our government, and the, the divisions within our society and the international conflicts that are totally needless but very dangerous. All of these things are plainly apparent, and it gives us opportunity, I think, to address them. And I hope that it turns out that we have the will to do that.
So one silver lining in this may be, as I heard a former president say on a video the other day, maybe we get rid of partisanship and polarization and we all think about the things that are actually important.
It would allow us to do that. But if we, if it turns out to be a partisan decision, whether you wear a mask or not, then we're really hopeless.
Well, yeah, I mean, if we're at that point, just give up, right? I mean, Steve, how has your work life changed? How is your life materially different? We have the good fortune, Larry and Steve and I, to all live within just a couple of blocks of one another. And I will look up driving to the supermarket, or I might be out with my dog, and I look up and there's Steve Harrigan with his headphones in, walking the neighborhood like no pandemic, like nothing. There is no stopping you. That part is the same, right?
It's those nuns after him, they're he's trying to get away.
Racing my past. My life is strangely somewhat the same because I work at home and I work with my, in an office with my imagination and with my research. And so that hasn't changed a lot. And I'm sequestered with Sue Ellen, my wife of almost 45 years. And we get along great. And we have 6 grandchildren within an 8-mile radius, but we can't
see them, right?
Except for 6 feet apart. But those things are demoralizing. The fact that you can't hug your grandchildren. But every time I think about how demoralizing this is, I think about how great I've got it. And I think all, somebody living in a housing project and in some crowded neighborhood in New York who has to push the elevator buttons and risk their life to go down to get a breath of fresh air and go to, leave go to work and leave the children with somebody or nobody. It's just, I think, that's front of mind. I feel like it's a kind of moral obligation to keep those, that front of mind for everybody, because it's just, we're living in an ivory tower, our jobs. And, we've got to sort of punch through that and see the world as it really is, or we're part of the big part of the problem.
Got to keep perspective. Absolutely. So we're going to come to the end here in a second. I want to ask each of you, as we head into summer, this is going to be the most non-summery summer ever, right? Non-traditional. It's not really going to be a big break. It's in some ways just going to be, a new time frame. But let's pretend that it's really the summer and we all have time to turn our attention to something that we would enjoy. I want to ask each of you if there's one book other than a book of your own, and you can't recommend a book of one of the other people on this call, so that's not okay, that you would recommend as summer reading as we close here. Jenna, anything that you've read recently that comes to mind?
Yes, I have two. One of the best parts of my job is I've started this Today Show book club, which has been so much fun, and I feel like the luckiest person to get to read ahead constantly. And so I'm reading, we've chosen books through September, but what I just chose, and a good friend of mine who lives in Brooklyn, who owns a little independent bookstore called Books Are Magic. Her name is Emma Straub, and I met her in the makeup chair. She's hilarious. And this book is a breath of fresh air. It's called All Adults Here. And I loved it. The other one that I'll recommend is another novel called Valentine. It's about West Texas. It's by a woman named Elizabeth Wetmore. She is 52, and it is her debut novel. Wow. It is about the oil boom in the 70s in Odessa, Texas, and 5 women who witnessed this traumatic event. There it is. All Adults Here is a little bit more fun. Valentine is darker, which I think.
And Valentine is a novel, you said, right?
It's a novel. Both of these are novels. And
it's her debut, and she's over 50. And
52 years old. Elizabeth Wetmore, she's from West Texas, moved to Chicago, has been writing this book for a decade. Right. And her husband actually took an extra job so that she could stay home and write. Amazing. And so those are the 2 books, Valentine, All Adults Here.
Larry, Steve, I will race you to the phone when we're done here to call Texas Monthly to tell them that they need to write a story about Elizabeth Wetmore.
I know.
Sure, it sounds like a Texas Monthly story to me. Mm-hmm. Larry, what's the book that you would be comfortable saying as a recommendation to people? Pick up this book this summer.
I know that I know very well that people have reservations about reading about a pandemic during a pandemic, but I've been reading pandemic books. I mainly, when I was working on my novel, I was reading research, and histories, but I've turned to look at, how other writers did it. And, one book that I read when I was in college, but I just really is so impressed with Catherine Ann Porter's Pale Horse, Pale Rider, and is extraordinary writing, but it was her own experience. And, she came down with the flu in 1918 and nearly died. She was working for a newspaper in Denver, and they set her obituary in type. When she came to, she was bald. Her hair grew back white. So the torment that she went through is reflected in that little novella, but it's wonderfully told.
Right.
But the other thing, I doubt that a lot of people are going to follow my advice, but I've been talking to a source in Italy who is a retired professor of medical history at Johns Hopkins, and I'm interested in the fact that the Black Death in Europe really opened the door to the Renaissance. It, put an end to the Middle Ages in many respects. And so I started reading Boccaccio's Decameron. And it's surprisingly, delightful, and it's translated by this UT professor. I tried to read it in another version; it was impenetrable. But this is totally delightful.
Yep.
It's about a group of 10 friends that are sheltering in place during the plague, and their stories are so ribald that you can really see that the Middle Ages, they're closing the door themselves. So it's very insightful and delightful at the same time.
Yeah, Steve, you're going to have to work hard to top the delightfulness of Black Death. Your answer. Go ahead.
Well, I'm reading. My wife is accusing me of not reading it fast enough because I keep telling people I'm reading it, but I've only gotten about a third of the way through, which is The Mirror and the Light by Hilary Mantel, who I think is probably the greatest living author on the planet right now. And this is, as everyone knows, this is the third volume of her historical fiction about Thomas Cromwell and the court of Henry VIII. And it is I wouldn't call it escapism because it's challenging, but it's escapism in the sense that you escape into another world that is absolutely, utterly credible. I don't. She's, as a historical novelist myself, I have no idea how she is able to project readers into this time and place with such validity. And right. It's really she's a truly wonderful, remarkable writer, I think.
What a great range of answers to that question. How much I appreciate them and how much I appreciate the three of you making time. Larry, Steve, great to be with you as always. Jenna, good to see you. Please tell your family hi for all of us.
Please do.
And good luck in quarantine. We will hold down the fort here in Texas. You hold down the fort in the Northeast for us. So I'm Evan Smith. I want to say thank you for watching. Remember that we're doing this during Texas Teachers Can Coalition celebration of Teacher Appreciation Week. Visit teacherscan.org to learn more and to celebrate teachers who deserve to be celebrated. They all deserve to be celebrated, and never more important than now. Thanks for watching, everybody. Take care.
Thanks, guys. Thank you, Evan. Bye, everybody.